Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, let your will be done through us. Amen.
Amen.
You may be seated. Years ago, I was on a track team. And when I ran high school track, frequently we had a couple hours between the end of school and our track meets. So on one occasion, I invited the track team, over to my house. And like most high school athletes, after school meant one thing: hunger. Hunger, hunger, hunger. Nothing like a hungry high schooler. So I pulled out the bread, I pulled out the cold cuts, I pulled out the toppings, I laid them all out on the kitchen counter so we could make some sandwiches. Well, that included in that luncheon buffet was this big box my mother used to buy, the 64-pack of Kraft American Singles. Okay, do you guys remember those? Some of you, I still have some in my fridge. It's kind of this pasteurized kind of cheese-ish product that's wrapped up in these plastic wrappers. And as we began making sandwiches, one of our tribe, a sprinter, was finishing with this like Dagwood Bumpstead size sandwich. And on this sandwich, he put several pieces of this cheese with the plastic wrapper still on. And so as he was picking it up to take this huge bite out of it, an observant high jumper stopped and stop, don't do that. That cheese is wrapped in plastic. Well, the embarrassed sprinter then put the sandwich down and took it apart, and people showed him how to take the plastic off and put the cheese back on. And the story, notwithstanding, this sprinter was no dummy. In fact, he went on to win all sorts of awards, athletic and academic, which helped out his football career, which was his first love, as next year he was recruited by one of the most academically rigorous schools in the country, the University of Michigan. And years later, we would kid him about this. He went on to play in the pros. Oh yeah, this guy's so smart. He eats cheese with the plastic still on it. Now, this story of a clueless and immature teenager comes to mind as you and I hear this familiar story. We've heard it dozens of times about Lazarus and about the rich man who, let's face it, he displayed an immaturity of his own. And here's what I mean by that. When we look closely at the story, we see this rich man exhibiting a hard to understand unawareness of his surroundings. You'd think that somebody who was rich was somewhat smart, aware, mature, his keen perception being rewarded with prosperity, possessions. We may not think that the rich man finally being awakened in Hades would make such immature comments as, you mean there are poor people out there? You mean there's something called karma? What I actually do comes back and visits me? You mean life is about paying attention and noticing and being mature? I know I'm being somewhat, kind to this rich man, but I want us to look at it through that lens this morning, my friends, is perhaps this was a mark of his immaturity. As we may have figured out now, a looming goal in our wondrous human adventure is growing up, is maturity. It's a place we're intended to go, though not necessarily where we have to go. And as we look at the culture around us, that it many times seems bent on wanting to breed immaturity. Immaturity about not reading the fine print when you sign something, right? Immaturity about jumping into things without evaluating the way a mature person might do. Stanford education professor Bill Damon describes maturity as that moment when we're able to make a firm commitment to an adult social role. So when an adolescent becomes mature, they have been able to make a firm commitment to an adult social role. This being a wide range of things that have one thing in common. Here's what maturity has in common. Life is no longer all about you. It's no longer all about you. So an adult social role may be joining the military. It may be committing to some other vocation, maybe becoming a parent, maybe giving your all to ordained ministry. Inherent in these adult social roles is that we have responsibilities and obligations that go beyond ourselves. And that's how we know when we're mature. We think first, perhaps, about the other person. Maturity comes when we know ourselves and have a sense of who we are, where we are, and of course, the responsibilities that those things entail. It's been said that the famous psychologist Carl Jung made a compelling contribution to the world with his idea of individuation. That is, the lifelong project of becoming more nearly the whole person, the mature person that we're meant to be, what the gods intended, not the parents or the tribe, or especially the easily intimidated or the inflated ego. While revering the mystery of others, our individuation summons each of us to stand in the presence of our own mystery. I would often say that. You know you're mature when you realize that, you know what, folks? We live in mystery. And part of maturity is figuring out how to live in mystery with the joy of the Lord. Embracing the faith that God gave us when Jesus said so many times, let your hearts not be troubled. Be not worried. I am here for you. And so we become more fully responsible for who we are in this journey that we call life. Friends, the title and topic of our sermon is an invitation for us all to grow up, or at least for us to grow up more. I think that's probably more the case. Growing into a people consumed not with our own journey, but conscious and conscientious about the journeys of others. That's why we're walking past those monuments when we come into church this morning. We're looking at the lives of others who have been cut down by gun violence last year, those affected by racial injustice. We need to be aware of those folks, especially those on the margins. And Jesus, you'll like the Eucharistic prayer today because it reminds us that Jesus had much more in common with Lazarus than he did with the rich man. Growing into a people who exemplify increasingly thinking beyond our own well-being. Growing into a people who understand more and more that the true nature of love is giving and being mindful of the plights of others. It's interesting, we mentioned this in our class right before our 10 o'clock service this morning as we went around kind of checking in and talking about the topic, that when we are mindful of the plights of others, when we are living a life of giving versus getting, that's something that older people seem to get more than younger people. You know, I quoted Jan Ernst, one of my favorite quotes, that, you know, hey, listen, been there, done that, got the t-shirt, and then gave it away at the garage sale, right? This cycle goes towards giving. And the older you get, the more you see how limited satisfaction from stuff gives us. We are all very familiar with the great depth and breadth of charity and selflessness which inhabits the soul of everyone within the sound of my voice. You are icons of giving. You are heralds of Christ's kindness. You are exemplary in your generosity. But none of us has yet reached perfection. We are all still on the road. And the questions we face are, what does maturity look like for us, even as the sum of years increases, even as the odometer adds digits? We ask that question. How is Jesus urging us to go deeper into him, deeper into faith, deeper into our service towards others? How are we more fully being asked to emulate Jesus and Jesus' example of self-knowledge, self-understanding, and selflessness? Let them eat cake is the traditional translation of the French phrase, qu'ils mangeront de la brioche. Wikipedia says it had been spoken in the 17th or 18th century by a great princess, attributed, of course, to, anybody remember? Marie Antoinette. Though experts today doubt that, the occasion of its utterance came upon her being told that the peasants had no bread. The French phrase mentions brioche, which is a bread enriched with butter and eggs, considered a luxury food. The quote, of course, is taken to reflect either the princess's frivolous disregard for the starving peasants or her poor understanding of their plight. This is the attitude you and I see in the rich man. This is the first thing we might notice about the rich man in our story. Let them eat cake. We may find it really hard to understand how he could possibly be so clueless about poor Lazarus, whose location and condition are detailed in our story. But like Marie Antoinette, apparently the rich man was clueless about Lazarus. He had somehow allowed a preoccupation with his own well-being to take over. Maybe that was it. Maybe he got so concerned with himself that there was no room to think of other people. His fine purple, his fine linen, his sumptuous feasting, we can fairly assume took a toll on his inability to understand that other people were suffering. And that's, folks, the danger of stuff. That can be the danger of stuff. It behaves as anesthetic, and we just don't know where the pain others are feeling is. In our epistle reading today, St. Paul warned us that those who want to be rich fall into temptation and are trapped by many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction, and that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. Jesus never said riches are bad, but he sure did hint to the fact that they were dangerous. They can take up our attention, and they can hide people like Lazarus that are right in front of us. So you and I fairly ask, in what ways are our comforts, our entertainments, our middle-class riches getting in the way of our perceptions of those who have less? In what ways are we stepping over the Lazaruses outside our front door without even knowing it? And how is God inviting us to grow up regarding the plight of those less fortunate in the world? We can never forget that the moral duty of all those who have much is to tend to those who have less. The moral duty of all of us who have much is that we ought to tend to those who have less. How many people watched the Queen's goings on this week? It was really a wonderful example of, I think, Anglican liturgy, including a lot of different things. But one of the towns that are grieving the Queen's death quite a bit, few are doing it as much as a town called Aberfan, Wales. Nearly 60 years ago, an avalanche of coal debris and water cascaded down a huge hillside and killed 144 villagers, most of them children, becoming one of the worst civilian disasters in contemporary British history. Aberfan, Wales, a village of just 3,500 people. It was devastated and became a focal point for the Queen, who would visit that town 4 times in the ensuing years, touching the hearts and lives of many people in that village. Quote, "She looked over us, she protected us, she had sympathy, she had empathy," said a village resident. "The Queen never let us down." Well, 6 decades later, as the Queen was being laid to rest, few Brits were so sad or more proud than the members of this little village. And despite rising costs of living, frustration with the government in London, and calls for independence, the mood in this quiet, sleepy village was one of sober appreciation. As the Queen had not forgotten them, they had not forgotten the Queen. Here's where we find our second lesson in our gospel, folks. This idea that what we do in life, it just comes back to us. Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things, but now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Now, I know we're tempted to think that's how heaven works, but this story really isn't about a detailed description of heaven. That's not the theme. But it does remind us of the reality of reaping what we sow, that there is an Aberfan kind of accounting going on, so much so that different religions have different names for it. I think we all know that word, karma. This reminds us of the importance of living not just for today, but keeping an eye on where we're going. Understanding that everything is connected, we don't live in a bubble, and the seeds we sow today of kindness or of harm will be harvested tomorrow. The seeds we sow today of kindness or of harm will be harvested tomorrow. So how aware are we of the ways we're living today and of the ways that will affect the lives we live tomorrow? Now, we think about climate change, we think about population growth, we think about the national debt, but being mature means thinking not just about what's right in front of us, but those who will follow us. How is the Lord inviting us to be more conscious of not just the first quarter or the game or the season, but of the career? How are we being invited to notice that what we sow will be what we reap? Some of you may remember the story about the accident that happened at my house 9 years ago that took the life of a man. Kenny had just retired from his years at the post office, and he was drawing his pension, and he was building up his landscaping business when he came to my house with his partner to rake leaves. And I loaned Kenny a rake, which was in my garage, told him to put it back when he was done. A few hours later, I was startled by screams from my wife, who had discovered that Kenny had somehow gotten caught in the garage doors and been crushed to death. And he was crushed to death in garage doors that I had installed on the cheap that did not have the proper safety features that they should have had. That's another story. The point of reminding you about this is that Kenny's death served as a hinged moment in my life. I'm inviting you to think about a hinged moment in your life. Never before had I been struck with such a stark example of the fragility of life, of the precarious nature of our existence, and of how limited the time is that you and I have to reflect the light of Jesus into the world. I think a lot of us have hinge moments of when that hit us, that level, that plateau of maturity in which we saw, gosh, life is that short. The gospel has only so much time to channel through me while I'm on this earth. This is the third lesson we learned from the rich man. Did you notice at the end of the story that he finally reached a plateau of awareness, of maturity, when he began to think of others? Father, I beg you, send Lazarus to my father's house. I have 5 brothers. Let them be warned that they may not also come here to this place of torment. It is here that the rich man finally gets it. He encounters maturity, that what he's done on earth has consequences, and that his proper posture all along should have been to help others. He too is getting a lesson on the fragility of life, on how little time we have to gladden the hearts of those with whom we share the journey. Where is that in each of our lives, friends? Let us not neglect the gift that is in us. Each one of us are here with a certain constellation of gifts and of relationships and with something important to do in our worlds. And we may downplay it. We may think there's not much to it because maybe there's not much fanfare or accolade. But each one of us has an enduring, important, irreplaceable, invaluable gift inside of us that God is using to bring God's work and God's kingdom to the world. Now is the time to strike out on a new and renewed walk with God. Can we remember those early days when we were called by Jesus, when we felt God's presence, God's guidance, God's love in our hearts, and we knew that there was work for us to do? We're being invited to remember those times, a hinge moment in which we reached a level of maturity that really made a difference. There's so much in this world that needs fixing, folks. Gosh, there's gun violence, there's grave economic inequality, there's devastating racial injustice. We have division in our country that's threatening our very democracy. The world is looking for a way. Guess what? Jesus is the way. The Jesus inside you, the Jesus inside me, who is calling us to deeper places of love. A Jesus who's not condemning us, a Jesus who is commending us and inviting us to go deeper with him. Of course, it begins with loving one another, with treating others as we would like to be treated, with being part of the solution and not part of the problem. Chiming in and saying, I can help here. I can do that. I can pick up that garbage, but you didn't put it there. Doesn't matter. That's not my job. My job is to help spread the love of God, the generosity and kindness that God's put in my heart to a world that needs it. For just as we have caused the problem, we can solve it. It starts with each one of us doing our little parts in our little corners of the vineyard. Let us awaken as the rich man did. Let us be aware of the poor around us. Let us behave knowing that what goes around comes around. And let us seek to grow, to mature in our faith, knowing that our life and perhaps the lives of many people around us may depend on it. Amen.